the care in the field of palliative care. We've sadly lost one of our speakers on disability, and we have some leaders of religious faith dominations with us this morning, because I know when I talk to many colleagues, the issues around palliative care, disability rights, and indeed people of faith, this is a very difficult issue. And I think what we will look forward to hearing this morning is that, as in all walks of life, there is a variety of views. There is a very lively and deeply felt debate happening in all sectors of our country. And I'm so grateful to our speakers this morning for stepping up to speak on behalf of their the people that they work with and represent, and share their thoughts with us this morning. And I think it's going to be a really helpful session, and look forward to questions at the end. So if I can move then, first of all, to introduce for the Dr. Jonathan Romaine from the Religious Alliance for Dignity in Dying. Jonathan, thank you for joining us.
Right, good morning, everybody. I'm a rabbi from Maidenhead, and I have to tell you, I was initially opposed to assisted dying, really for all the sort of knee-jerk traditional reasons, thou shalt not. But actually, I changed my mind, and for three reasons, some of which might apply to you yourself too. One was just going around hospitals and hospices and seeing so much suffering. I mean, one of the images in my mind is of a man who was literally on his knees on the hospital bed. I mean, lying on the bed on his knees, his head bowed, and just in utter pain. And I just thought, this can't be right, and it can't be religious. There must be something we can do. Secondly, when I started investigating, I found that there were increasing number of safeguards that would prevent against any abuse of the system, such as the person has to be terminally ill. They have to be mentally competent. They have to be doing it of their own free will. And then the real sort of killer punch, if you like, was knowing what was going on in Oregon, where this system, the same British system that's being proposed, has been going on for 25 years. So actually, we're not doing a leap into the dark. We can almost say something ridiculous like, we can predict the future because actually we know what's been happening for the last quarter of a century and that it's worked. So the more I thought about it, the more I became in favor, and in favor for religious reasons, because there's nothing sacred about suffering. There's nothing holy about agony. And if we can protect against any abuses as well, then why on earth not? And in fact, I would stress that and say, this is something that is not only possible, but desirable. It's a positive step, because frankly, in whose interest are we forcing people who are terminally ill and suffering and want to let go of life? In whose interest are we forcing them to stay alive? And yes, of course, as a religious person, life is precious, but we can still help people avoid a terrible death at the end of that precious life. The only negatives, frankly, I can see are the current options, where people have to suffer on, or they have to commit suicide, which is a very lonely death, can sometimes be botched and result in an awful last few days, and certainly terrible for the family to discover the body afterwards. Or the other option, I suppose, is going to Dignitas, but as we know, going abroad means it's expensive, and also it means you have to take end your life early, because you have to be fit enough to go onto an aeroplane and go abroad. And that's why I helped found the Religious Alliance for Dignity in Dying, to show that you can be in favor of assisted dying and religious. And the group consists of vicars, rabbis, priests, imam, you're going to hear from Taj in a moment, and bishops, and actually archbishops as well. The former archbishops, George Carey, and perhaps the most iconic religious figure in the last 100 years, Desmond Tutu. And the fact that they're all on board must say something, as well as lots of lay people. So to sum up, yes, there are still religious opponents, but they're also religious supporters. In fact, I would say there's an overwhelming number of religious supporters, and you may know the figures that amongst the general population, 84% of people are in favor, but remarkably, we broke that down to see what was going on in the religious world, and say, for instance, of Christians, 82% of Christians are also in favor. And that's not just nominal Christians, it's measured by people who go to church once a month. Now, frankly, in political terms, that would be a landslide. In fact, not a landslide, it'll be an absolute avalanche. So we are hoping that you are going to help us and legalize assisted dying.
Aaron, you're on mute.
The classic of abiding by the feedback situation. Thank you. That was Rabbi Romain. That's a fantastic introduction and a quite a phenomenal alliance there that you are working with across faiths on this issue, and we very much are pleased to work with you. Next, to talk about the theology of assisted dying in Islam, I'd like to really welcome Imam Dr. Taj Hagi. Dr. Hagi.
Thank you. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. This is an Arabic phrase for in the name of God, the most merciful, the most gracious. This important invocation is by far the most mentioned phraseology in the Quran. God is seen as a definitive embodiment of universal mercy, clemency, and grace. In Quranic terminology, the Creator emphasizes that He is the epitome of beneficence and compassion. Therefore, if the Lord is magnanimous and merciful, would Almighty really expect that the terminally ill, those at the tail end of their lives, are subject to excruciating pain and unbearable discomfort, that they have to prolong life and endure agonizing, undignified, and dehumanizing deaths? When such gravely afflicted people have been certified by reputable and independent medical specialists that they have only a few months to live, why can't they implement their own will to die with dignity and to end the remorseless pain and needless suffering that they experience in their final moments? While Islam's sacred scripture discourages and denounces all forms of suicide, this general prescription is not pertinent to the question of contemporary assisted dying. In several Quranic verses, the Lord instructs believers not to capriciously take their own lives or those of others, and incidentally also outlaws all forms of suicide or kamikaze attacks. Indeed, devout adherents are counseled to confront the normal trials and tribulations of life with equanimity and forbearance. And for this reason, Orthodox Islam considers suicide and euthanasia in direct contravention with explicit scriptural commandments worthy of eternal damnation. Moreover, traditional Islam admits that the Lord is the ultimate giver and taker of life. Humans are therefore not entitled to accelerate or advance the time of their departure. However, these prevailing Islamic perspectives must be reviewed and reanalyzed in the light of modern medicine, as well as the burgeoning rights of people to regulate or mitigate their final days when dealing with painful and remorseless terminal inevitability. One of the primary facets of progressive Quranic Islam, as opposed to dogmatic populist Islam, is the scriptural principle of ijtihad, or individual reasoning and analytical explication. This key juristic mechanism of deploying holistic interpretations to address present-day issues is deliberately dismissed by the conventional clergy. And such customary clerics retain their umbilical bonds to their South Asian and Middle Eastern homelands by assiduously refusing to fully integrate into mainstream British society. But forward-looking Muslim scholars and liberal theologians have jettisoned the suspect secondary sources like the Hadith, the Sharia, and the fatwas that underpin populist Islam to embrace ijtihad, individual thinking, as the most effective instrument in promoting an Islam that is firmly rooted in and relevant to 21st century Britain. From this unassailable theological foundation that endorses novel exposition, a Quranic manifestation of British Islam is championed by intrepid and integrated Muslims to play a full productive role in the United Kingdom today. And not surprisingly, this religious focus on active, meaningful participation in British life embodies a commitment to project and sustain human rights at every level, including the prerogative to die with dignity, to end one's life when there's no realistic medical hope for a better quality of existence for those experiencing extreme suffering. And since God encapsulates unrivaled bounty and benevolence, brave and trend-setting Muslim scholars incorporate innovative textual hermeneutics and contemporary insights, embracing both the letter as well as the spirit of Islam's transcendent text to craft a relevant theology to address the currently controversial question of regulated assisted dying. They rightly ask, why should Almighty insist that humans have to extend life in the face of extreme pain and heartless suffering? Now, in an age where medical advancements have reached unprecedented heights in prolonging life, Muslims, like everyone else, need to comprehend that this is not always the best outcome for those enduring debilitated diseases such as leukemia, cancer, AIDS, and so forth. When the quality of a person's life has deteriorated to such an extent and reached a point of no return in terms of endless pain and gratuitous anguish, Should an empowered individual not have the right to depart this life if they consciously choose to do so with the residual dignity instead of continued coercive suffering? Clearly, all necessary safeguards and appropriate regulations have to be implemented so that any proposed legal validation of assisted dying cannot be exploited or abused for nefarious purposes. Otherwise, it will degenerate into a slippery slope to condone indiscriminate self-killing. It's only humane and civilized to permit people to leave this world when there are no practical prospects to halt inordinate suffering and to terminate their own lives. From the Islamic standpoint, therefore, this voluntary ending of life in these very specific circumstances should be seen as self-selected relief, a personal liberation from intolerable agony. Even though assisted dying is not something that is lauded in the Islamic scripture, it nevertheless represents a dignified exit as well as a comforting return home to the Lord. Desperate and despairing Muslims who elect to end their lives in this particular manner can be guilt-free and reassure themselves with the uplifting Quranic truism found in Surah Al-Araf, chapter 7, verse 156 of the Quran, when the Creator comforts believers by reminding them that God's compassion and mercy encompasses everything and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That is I really appreciate the time and to share that with. I know that's going to be really important for many of my colleagues to hear and understand and start debate as well. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen Duckworth, who's going to talk about disabled people's views on assisted dying. Dr. Duckworth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed. And sorry you can't see me live on video today, but unfortunately for medical reasons, I'm laid up in bed. But not to conflate the idea of disability and health conditions, please. You see there a picture of me. So I've been a wheelchair user for the last 40 years. I broke my neck, and so I'm paralysed from the neck down. I have no movement or sensation below my neck. But I've had a strong and fulfilling life, which has been wonderful. Until about 10 years ago, I was actually also very opposed to assisted dying in quite a radical way. But then I was given the opportunity to explore the evidence in detail. And coming from both a medical and academic background, I did a PhD into disability equality and human rights. It became very clear to me that the current approach was unsustainable. However, there is a strong but very small minority of highly influential disabled people, including some members of the House of Lords, who remain opposed to assisted dying. They set up a Facebook page which has accumulated the grand total of 650 followers over the last 7 years, yet they claim to represent the views of all disabled people. But most importantly, some recent independent research demonstrates the facts, which are that 86% of disabled people in the UK are in favour of a change in the law. So for every one of their Facebook followers, there are in fact 120,000 other disabled people who disagree with them. Group of vociferous individuals clearly has some concerns, but each of these can be easily refuted, and they can be refuted by the evidence that I gained from sitting on the Commission on Assisted Dying in 2011, published in our report in 2012, which runs to over 600 pages long. The issue for me is more important when you consider what disability organisations are saying. And a study published earlier this year, in January 2021, on the views of disability rights organisations in England on assisted dying, it actually revealed that only 4% of them had an official position against a change in the law. And they claiming that this is a widely held opinion amongst disabled people generally, and the organisations that support or represent us, risks in stifling the debate. where those that are supportive of assisted dying feel unable to express our views openly, but I'm prepared to take that on. Indeed, it goes beyond that, because far too often I've seen non-disabled opponents of a law change exploit the experiences of disabled people and the inequalities and fears that we endure in our daily lives. The result of that is that they've misused this as a smokescreen for their own agendas to block progress on this issue. Not only is this misleading to me, but it's also offensive. Why should non-disabled people use us as a smokescreen? It also infers incorrectly that the rights of terminally ill people come at the expense of the rights of disabled people. They do not. There is no hierarchy of rights. Equality for disabled people cannot be addressed by denying disabled people the autonomy, choice, and control that they want and deserve over their lives. In conclusion, I applaud the disability rights campaigners who have campaigned very successfully for autonomy, choice, and control over all of our lives, and I'm really grateful to them for their efforts. Without this, I wouldn't enjoy the life that I do now, with my work, my family, and my loving wife. However, death and the dying process is one of the most important aspects of all our lives. I am completely at a loss to be able to understand why they should perpetuate myths and prevent somebody like me, when I become terminally ill, as I will do one day, from exercising my autonomy, choice, and control over the way I die. I want my family and friends to be around me. I want to lie on a beach in the sunset. I want to toast the contribution that they have made to my happiness with a glass of chilled wine. And I want them to celebrate my life with me, not after I've died. And then I want to quietly slip away, peacefully, with an assisted death, as a happy, contented human being. Surely that's not too much to ask. The small minority of disabled people make such important but inaccurate points. We should go with the majority of disabled people's feelings. 86% of us support a change in the legislation. Please listen to the majority. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for sharing that with us this morning, and very vivid image. And now have a view that beach and that glass of wine and that choice, and that's exactly what many of us here in Parliament want to try and make do, and that fantastic campaigning work you've done throughout life to allow that choice to happen. Thank you for that. Next, I'd like to move to Dr. Bill Crawley, who's going to reflect on the assisted dying debate from the perspective of a hospice doctor. Dr. Crawley, thank you for joining us.
Thank you and good morning. So I'm a former GP, a practice palliative care lead, and an experienced palliative care physician working in community hospital and hospice settings. Now, I fully acknowledge that for the majority who have access to specialist palliative care, that they die with adequate symptom control, dying mostly what might be termed good deaths. However, in my own experience of dying patients, a significant minority have inadequate symptom control, and in my estimation, perhaps 5%. And Macmillan has reported an estimated 10% of patients who die in England each year experience inadequate pain relief in the last 2 days of life. Furthermore, a report from the Office of Health Economics concludes that over 6,000 die in the UK each year with inadequate pain relief in the last 3 months of life, and that is despite the best efforts of the palliative care specialists. Why not afford those who have subjectively intolerable symptoms, such as pain, the choice to die peacefully? Now, while many people focus on pain relief at the end of life, just as serious a consideration for many is the inability to control other distressing symptoms. I have been asked many times by patients whether I can assist their dying, and those who work with dying people have heard families saying, "You wouldn't put your dog through this," more often than they care to remember. I've dealt with a number of patients with motor neurone disease who are dependent upon their ventilators to breathe. They're given the option of indicating their wish to remove the mask so that they can die. The measures taken are usually heavy sedation and opiates prior to this removal. And I have had patients that, in my view, have obvious air hunger when the masks are removed. And can you imagine what it might be like to be even slightly aware that you can't breathe? We make assumptions that, in my view, are extremely unsafe, that the sedation has been enough to grant them a peaceful death. I don't doubt that many do die peacefully, but we have no way of truly knowing that these measures are actually allowing them this peaceful death. A far more assured way would be to allow them to choose the removal of the mask after they were given a life-ending anesthetic agent that renders them irrefutably unconscious. This would assure all parties that adequate peace and dignity was afforded to them, and that the bereavement that the families face would be reduced by seeing their loved ones die in an assuredly peaceful way. I've dealt with patients who have had tumours wrapped around their windpipes and compress it. This would surely feel akin to slow strangulation. As the tumour progresses, they have marked increased difficulty in breathing, and despite the high doses of the agents given, they often continue to have a profound sense of not being able to breathe, which is obvious not only by the few words that they're able to say, but by the objective signs of someone struggling in extremis. Again, surely this is an example where assisted dying would have avoided this suffering. I can give further examples that include those whose bowels are obstructed, most often by cancer. Almost all of these patients vomit feces, and although the associated nausea can be mostly controlled, the indignity and foul nature of this vomiting is tormenting and distressing both for patients and families alike. Further, not infrequent examples are patients who have tumours that are fungating and those that are invading their genito-anal regions. These people experience the humiliation of their tumours causing a malodor of rotting flesh that is obvious throughout the unit. Who would wish to remember their loved ones dying in this way, to say nothing of those who have to tolerate such symptoms? I have often tried to have meaningful discussions with my colleagues about assisted dying, and it's met with either silence or a rapid change of the subject. And sadly, I think their positions may be informed more by personal opinion and beliefs than the wishes of our patients and the evidence we have available to us. There's been little research into ascertain why this opposition is so firmly held, but one view is that patients may be subject to coercion. But the proposed safeguards in the assisted dying legislation are similar to those advocated in the Association of Palliative Medicine's guidance. And as you all perhaps know, this association is vehemently opposed to assisted dying. So in their safeguards of withdrawal of ventilation, it seems to me, since the two are equated, it seems to me that at least one of their objections is invalidated. I have felt compelled to speak out against those who would portray the whole palliative care community as monolithically opposed to assisted dying, as the number of supportive doctors is ever increasing, as they too have cared for patients like I have, who would have wanted that choice. So in summary, in my estimation and experience, choice at the end of life to have an assuredly dignified death in skilled hands is the only way we can be sure that patients do not have to tolerate subjectively intolerable symptoms. And finally, to quote an opinion piece in the current Oncology Journal, to be forced to continue living a life that one deems intolerable is an unspeakable violation of an individual's freedom to live and to die as he or she sees fit. Thank you.
Thank you, and that is of course a great summation. I think thank you for sharing so vividly that perhaps many people on the call will fortunately not have experienced or witnessed for their loved ones of some of the actualities of those terrible end of life days or moments, and as you said, the indignity and the humiliation for people that I think none of us, for those who have witnessed it, stays with you. And for others who haven't, appreciate that some of that may not come as shocking, but that is the reality. And thank you for sharing that and for speaking up from your profession today. And I think for all our speakers, we'll come on to questions, but as you say, the monolithic view that sometimes appears to be coming forward, and what all our speakers have been able to do is actually show out that that is not the case. Thank you, Dr. Crawley. Our final speaker is one of my colleagues. Delighted that Christine Jardine is joining us this morning. And I know for many of you who've been campaigners, our speakers in this area for many years, frustrated at the slowness of the UK Parliament's response to this, but we're very pleased to see that fantastic debates in Jersey and Guernsey, and now in Holyrood in Scotland. I think that's really important about the process that's happening in Scotland. We don't see often what's going on in Scotland. We're quite parochial here in Westminster sometimes. So Christine, you can unmute yourself and share with us what is happening in Scotland, because I think many of our UK colleagues will be very interested in this process and the timing of the debate now. Christine.
Thank you, Karen. Like you, I have found this morning hugely reassuring, because there is not the monolithic approach that we're often led to believe, and I particularly found what our religious representatives had to say reassuring. In Scotland, we have, of course, twice been down the route of a bill getting to the point of being voted on in Parliament, and twice it has failed. The late Margot MacDonald steered both bills through. Unfortunately, she's no longer with us. But my colleague Liam MacArthur, who is the MSP for Orkney, has announced his intention to bring forward a new bill to this current Parliament. Now, it's a move which has been very carefully thought through. The timing has been very carefully discussed and deliberated on, because Liam and lots of us and several other organisations that he's been speaking to feel that there has been something of a sea change in the Scottish Parliament with the elections earlier this year, that there is not just more support amongst the MSPs, but it reflects more the position in Scotland, where the research and the opinion polls about the public view of assisted dying is very positive, and that is now reflected much more in Parliament. And so Liam, who is, and this is not insignificant, the Deputy Presiding Officer of the Parliament, has lodged his intention to bring forward a bill on assisted dying in this Parliament. And we expect that, I was speaking to him this week, and we expect that bill will actually come forward in September. The way it works in the Parliament, he has lodged his intention, and there will now be a consultation process, which he will go in, which will be undertaken, and then he will get the results of that, and then the bill will be based on very much on the consultation process. But the timing is important, because the Scottish National Party, who are the main party of government in Scotland at the moment, had in their manifesto that they would like to see this go to a citizens' assembly. And that will be one of the things which now happens in Scotland as well. We're expecting there will be a citizens' assembly which will discuss assisted dying, and both that and the consultation process will feed into the bill which Liam brings forward in September. He is also taking part in discussions with the other parties, and I'm possibly slightly biased in this, but I think Liam is someone who is in a particularly strong position to lead on this debate now that Marco's no longer with us. He has a reputation of being someone who is well respected in Parliament and who has a lot of support across Parliament, across different parties for that. And his stewardship of the bill, I think, will be important. He's also seen as someone who is very much a serious politician, that it's about this specific issue and his own experience that is very important. He's expecting there will be a fair degree of organised opposition to it, but he is working closely with Dignity in Dying, I know, and several other organisations. And the bill which he brings forward, he is intending will have a very narrow definition, in the same way as we've discussed a bill in Parliament with a very narrow definition, that it is that narrow definition which has so much public support. It will have all the safeguards that the previous bills which came to the Scottish Parliament had before. It will indemnify, he is anticipating it will indemnify the medical professionals so that they will be protected. It will have an end-of-life definition which will mean it will only apply to those who have a terminal diagnosis. There will be no sort of time set on that terminal diagnosis. It doesn't need to be a particular length of time, just a terminal diagnosis. They will have the mental capacity. And he's also looking at some form of mechanism whereby if the person is not able to administer the drugs or anaesthetic, as we've just heard themselves, then there will be a way of doing it. There has been, I think, a sea change in the Scottish Parliament, and Liam is ensuring that he is working with every party, that this does not in any way become an issue which is about politics. I think we have got to the point in Scotland that I would have hoped we would have got to a few years ago. But the public debate is now much more reflective of the views that we have heard this morning in the discussion. It is much more open to the possibility of change in the law. And there is very much a feeling that the time has come, that this is the last great liberal reform that we can, and in my view should have, in this country, that would make such a difference to so many people. And I am quietly confident that the debate, which will begin in earnest in September, will be one which has a positive outcome. And as I say, comes at the right time. The Scottish, I will be keeping in touch with Liam about Baroness Meach's bill and discussing with him very closely where there is overlap, any support that he may need down here, and similarly any information, any support that we need in Westminster. Liam is happy to discuss with us.
That's helpful. Christine, can I ask you, can you explain to us what the consultation process means? Is that a parliamentary consultation process for those of us who don't know the Scottish Parliament?
Yes, it's they will launch a consultation process which the Parliament will do, which will be done publicly through the Scottish Government's website. And interested groups, churches, disability organisations, Dignity in Dying, all groups who are have, if you like, an interest or have a view and an opinion or represent anyone who might be affected in any way, will be encouraged to make representations to that. But also individuals will be encouraged to make representations to it. So the likes of myself, I don't have a direct voice in the Scottish Parliament, but I'll be able to contribute to it. But also the other significant thing is the SNP having a commitment to a citizens' assembly on the issue. Now, I did think when Liam and I were discussing this that actually that might be a way forward in the rest of the UK as well, to have a citizens' assembly. the consultation process is a kind of standard thing, really, in Scotland for a lot of these things. But I think a citizens' assembly, we've seen where it can succeed in Ireland. It was so successful on the abortion issue in Ireland, and it can be as successful in this issue in Scotland. And I think if there were possibility of having a citizens' assembly for the rest of the UK, for England and for Wales, we would find that they would come back with a positive view. And I think that reflection of public opinion and what goes forward is vital. And the bill which comes forward in Scotland in September will have the benefit of being able to be seen as already reflecting public opinion and having the support of the public. And I think at that point, it will get a great deal of support. Liam and others have been talking to MSPs from all parties, and this time they are quietly confident that there has, because of the new, the change, there's been a huge change in the actual personnel in Holyrood. This time there may well be the support to get the bill through. And I think timing will be important, whether it actually comes to a final vote in the Scottish Parliament before a bill here could reach that stage. I don't know, but if it does, then it could actually be important for us.
Thank you. Christine, thank you so much. You carry Margaret MacDonald's flame fantastically here in the UK Parliament. I know that's really important to you. And I think for colleagues, my parliamentary colleagues on the call, I know some have raised this with me, that the idea of some sort of citizens' assembly, having that debate out with would be something that they're interested in. I know people have very strong views about that and the role of legislation and parliamentary democracy. But that's really helpful update. Thank you. And we will follow that very closely and work with them. But our speakers today, their voices are so critical in helping informing that debate, and the bravery of some to step outside some professional loud voices, the monolithic voices that we're sometimes told are existing. We're so grateful for the work that you've done, and again, some of you have changed your mind on that. We're open for questions now to our panelists as they come through, so please do come back to some of our panelists, because I think what we've heard this morning is so powerful, and I know that many colleagues hear this from their constituents or from other colleagues, so we'll come back on that. I think Andrew, you wanted to come in on part of that around hospice, I think.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Karen, and what a fantastic presentation we've had this morning. Really moving and really interesting, and very good news from Christine about the Scottish dimension, which is incredibly encouraging and which we'll follow very, very closely. My question really was to Bill, because our friends but opponents on this often suggest that were there proper funding for palliative care and hospices, what we are seeking wouldn't be necessary. And I just wonder, particularly in view of his very compelling points, whether Bill would like to comment on that argument so we can all hear his professional view on that.
So, Andrew, if I understand your question correctly, it's whether perhaps your question is addressing whether the palliative care community feel threatened, or the hospices feel threatened if assisted dying was introduced. Is that, am I?
Well, it's partly that, but it's much more whether or not the argument that were enough money put forward for palliative care and hospices, the argument that we are putting would fall away, because, I mean, obviously I don't agree with this, but I just think it's very helpful to have your professional view on whether that argument, which is often put by our friends on the other side, whether that argument has any validity whatsoever. And I have to say, I am expecting you to say no, but I just think hearing from a professional like yourself would be very helpful on the debate.
It's well known that the palliative care community feel that they are too few in number, under-resourced, and the need is far too great. But I think that if they felt that enough funding were forthcoming, even if everyone who was dying had access to specialist palliative care, my impression, and it can only be that really, is that the palliative care community would still be mostly opposed.
Could I also add to that, Andrew and Karen,
Yes.
in that the experience in Australia has shown that in the states where assisted dying legislation has been introduced, there has been significant additional funding invested in palliative care. So quite the contrary, introduction of assisted dying legislation appears, at least in some geographies, to increase the funding for palliative care.
Thank you.
The same thing has happened in Oregon as well, where the interest in end-of-life care has mushroomed, and it's benefited both the palliative community as well as assisted dying, and they now work hand in hand, which is wonderful.
Yes. No, I think that, and I think actually that's something we said before, that coming out the pandemic and some of the discussions we've understood, and the way people that are dying alone in hospital and away from family is an important part of this debate. Dr. Crawley.
Yes, what's worth mentioning also is the fact that in Oregon, I forget the association's name, but the association related to hospice care in Oregon that was initially opposed, once the legislation had been passed, then they became for it. So I think the same is probably true in this, probably will be true in this country. I think some of it is about them feeling that their jobs may be threatened, their livelihoods, their specialty might be threatened. But I still have the impression that there's a lot of work to be done to persuade, in particular, the palliative care community, because the rest of medicine, I mean, the stats are, as far as the BMJ reports, that 23% of palliative care doctors agree with assisted dying. And the next closest to them were the renal physicians, where 54% agree. And everybody else was on the agreement side. So I think there's still a gap between palliative medicine and the rest of medicine. But I believe and trust that it will change. It will have to change.
That's great insight. Thank you so much. Before I call Lord Vincent with the question, can Dr. Romain and Dr. Hagi perhaps outline what sort of conversations have you had with your own congregations on this subject? Dr. Romain, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so it depends very much. Sorry, it's a one-way conversation. And in that most people are in favour. And just to give you a short anecdote that highlights this, I gave a talk not so long ago to the leaders of the Samaritans. And as you would expect, they weren't necessarily in favour. And after my talk, I got lambasted by this speaker and that speaker. And then right at the end, I said, look, okay, fair enough. But let me ask you one question. If it was you personally, and you were dying of motor neuron or whatever, and dying in pain, would you want that option of an assisted death for yourself? There were 100 people in the room, 100 hands shot up. That says it all. And it's so arrogant, I think, of some people, who are, of course, people can be against it. That's fair enough. But they should be against it for themselves. And they shouldn't let their own ideology prevent other people having the right to an assisted death. Thank
you. Dr. Hagi.
In the Muslim community, the opposition to assisted dying is entirely emotional. It's not actually based on reason. And as Dr. Romain has just pointed out, and if the tables were turned and this was it was their issue to deal with, all of them would be agreeable to it. So I think we need to work assiduously and with the long-term objective to convince people that this is not actually killing people just for the fun of it. That this is, really a huge personal responsibility that someone who's fully empowered takes at his or her end of life care. And I think everyone's entitled to that. And if human rights is to mean something, it's got to mean something not just whilst we are alive, but also during our terminal phases of our existence. Human rights should be indivisible right to the end. So I think this is what we need to, from a Muslim perspective, need to harp on. And I would imagine same in the Jewish community, Christian community, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, and other communities. We need to convince people that this is not some lackadaisical attempt to enforce killing, but it's actually an act of great mercy and relief for everyone concerned.
I think that's right. Your views on mercy and compassion, and that's a really helpful theological comparison too for us. Lord Vincent, do you want to ask your question? If not, I can answer. See it in the question. So Lord Vincent made the point, I think, really, that nowadays that if we can plan the date of birth and there is no religious objection, then why not plan the date of death? That's a point I've made to many colleagues, that the choice that one's afforded throughout one's life in all sorts of situations and healthcare, but absolutely no choice really when you are most vulnerable. But thank you for that contribution. Ronnie Cowan, do you want to ask your question? You attended another group. It's joyful when you can't see people, is it?
Well, I've been on meeting now. Can you hear me now?
I can, Ronnie. Yes, go ahead. Ask your question. Thank you for joining us.
Control of all the technology this morning. Fortunately, you don't get to see me, but you do get to hear me. My question, I attended the other group. I genuinely don't know what it's called, but it's got a different view on assisted dying, and they weren't rambunctious about it. They weren't aggressive about it. They put forward their argument and basically said, we don't agree with the principles of assisted dying. And I asked them the question, it was a similar makeup of a panel, and I asked them the question, do you believe that currently within the UK's NHS systems, patients who are terminally ill are being given doses of pain relief, be it morphine or whatever, which are ultimately what kills them rather than the illness killing them? And they told me absolutely not. I was conflating the two things, in that the illness was killing them and the illness was going to kill them, and I shouldn't be confused with the fact that they're also taking high levels of morphine or whatever. What's the view of this panel to that question? Are the levels of pain relief killing the patients? And in effect, we already have assisted dying.
Well, can I take that on?
Yes, please, Dr. Crawley.
I'm probably the best place, forgive the other panelists, to answer that question. Well, there's a well-known maxim applied in palliative care called the Doctrine of Double Effect, which means that if you give a dose of morphine or midazolam, which is a sedative, which is intended as a primary purpose to relieve pain and suffering, but as a secondary unintended purpose accelerates dying, then that is thought to be, and lawfully is, the right side of the debate. So I think in answer to your question, I think it happens a great deal, actually. I think these drugs do accelerate people's deaths, but it should be recognized that is a secondary consequence, not the primary intention. And I think all palliative care specialists, at least the ones I've encountered, and they are many, and I've no reason to believe that the rest of my colleagues don't act in the same way, they all practice the doctrine of double effect. And it's been, I think I'm right in saying it's been tried and tested in the courts and found to be morally and legally, professionally acceptable.
Thank you.
Can I just come back
to answer your question?
Yes, Ronnie, yes, if you want to.
Just very briefly, you said it's not a primary intention, but it's a known and unavoidable consequence.
Oh yes, I think there's absolutely no doubt about it that giving these drugs can accelerate someone's dying. But again, forgive me repeating myself, but it has to be stressed that it is a unintended consequence of giving these drugs, the primary purpose of which was to alleviate suffering.
Thank you.
Can I just add a
yes, Doctor, I was going to, yes.
I mean, I did mention before that I had a medical training. I spoke to many of people who I qualified with in and around the period that I qualified who became GPs. And we know that most dying people die at home. They're not in the palliative care system. And each and every one that I spoke to, without exception, said that the use of continuous deep sedation, which is, as has just been described by Bill, is common practice. And, you know, the double effect results in the dying of those individuals. Who's to say what the primary objective was? But obviously it can be claimed to reduce pain, but essentially it does result in dying. So it's already going on, it's commonplace.
Thank you. Ronnie Cowan, thank you for raising that, because it is really important for us as parliamentarians to understand the reality again of what doctors in all professions, all specialties are dealing with. And thank you, Dr. Crawley, for being so vivid with us about the reality. Dr. Duckworth, can I come back to you from a question which is, you know, you've spoken very, very firmly and campaigned so fantastically, but what has been the reaction of disabled people that you've talked to about legislation in other countries? Because we know this is now working very well and very safely in many jurisdictions. Have you had those sorts of conversations with disabled people of all views?
I haven't consulted with disabled people in overseas countries, but of...
No, sorry, I'll be clear. Given that it's happened in other places, what do people here know or understand or feel about that?
I think that generally it's not known. We have 200 million people, you know, on planet Earth who have access to assisted dying. It's a number that's growing and will continue to grow rapidly, which I support. I think that people's disabled people's concerns and anxieties are spurious. They're not based on the evidence. They're more an emotional connection with the way that disabled people are perceived generally by society. And there's no reason why many disabled people shouldn't internalize the commonly held myths about disabled people, that we are of less value, we do contribute less. You know, it's simply untrue. And the evidence from the fact that 86% of disabled people are in favor of a change in the law, you know, clearly parallels the 85% of non-disabled people who are in favor of a change in the law, is irrefutable. So, you know, let's go with the majority view.
Thank you. Thank you. My colleague Caroline Noakes has a question, if we can allow her to come in. Caroline, thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
And it wasn't a question, more a comment. And I feel very privileged that Stephen Duckworth is actually my constituent and has worked very hard over the past few years to change my mind. And I was very interested to hear him say that he had changed his. I think there comes a point, doesn't there, for all of us, when we look at the evidence, we listen to the stories from our constituents and come to the view that what we currently have is a situation where you're available to access assisted dying if you're well enough to travel and if you have the fiscal resources to do so. So effectively, it's means tested access, isn't it? And I just wanted to understand what more we can do as parliamentarians, what more pressure we can put on so that we can be constructive and a helpful voice.
Thank you for that. And another comment I have is from Joshua Nicol in Mary Kelly Foy's office, who raises the issue again about social class and affordability. This is an argument that I put forward in my own speeches on this issue, in that people, if they've got the money, can afford to die somewhere else. It would be interesting to hear, as a wrap-up comments, anything else you want to add from our expert panel about that issue, because if people do have the money, they can afford the choice, and how can we afford that dignity to everyone else in society? and given Caroline's comments about choice. So if I go round, and any final comments from our expert panel, that'd be great. Dr. Crawley.
Well, the problem with that is it may very well be true that those with enough money can seek assisted dying elsewhere. The problem is, and you all may have seen, if you haven't seen it, you should, Simon's Choice, The Right to Die, the BBC documentary about the gentleman with motor neurone disease, who had to travel to Switzerland whilst he was still well enough and enjoying life to end his life. And yes, he had enough money to do that, and that is morally questionable, given that that access is not afforded to the rest of the population. But his life was terminated before it really needed to be, and perhaps by several months. So I think that that question is relevant and needs to be open in the debate.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Romain.
Yes, by legalizing assisted dying in this country, it would mean people can leave the taking a sort of fatal medication to the last possible moment. And of course, it will be open to all, irrespective of class or money or status. And just to sort of stress that, yes, there are voices against it, but I think there is a vast hinterland of support, whether people are religious or not. And I think it would be lovely if MPs and lords and peers could listen to the hinterland and not just some of the hierarchies against.
Excellent put, and you've helped us in that today. Thank you, Dr. Taji. Dr. Haji.
I think it's important for parliamentarians and others to bring this matter to the fore. For example, like the way we dealt with the capital punishment, with gay rights, with abortion. I mean, it became a frontline debate and discussion point for the entire community, and parliamentarians especially shouldn't shirk from this. From the Muslims' perspective, we need parliamentary voices, because otherwise we're drowned out by this fundamentalist imported clergy coming from Saudi Arabia and other backward places. And it's important that we have open-minded, intrepid, brave, courageous parliamentarians also putting their heads above the parapet and saying, listen, we need to have something that's actually going to be good for the entire society and not for a segment of the community.
Thank you. Dr. Duckworth.
Yeah, just to build on what others have said rather than repeat, disabled people travelling to Dignitas will, like myself, I would need someone to travel with me, exposing them to be vulnerable to being arrested upon their return for the current situation with the much dated 1961 Suicide Act, because assisted suicide in that respect is not legal, although we're not arguing in this forum for assisted suicide, we're arguing for assisted dying. In addition, it does shorten life, and the fact that you go to Switzerland and you make the effort and you spend the money really prevents you from changing your mind at the last minute. If I'm sat on my beach in the sunset with a syringe drive fitted in my arm, when I've got an iPad I can talk to that will activate the syringe drive, so I'm actually killing myself, the assistance I need is to put the needle in. If I'm having a good time, I want the party to go on a few hours, I'll have it going on a few hours, or a few days, or a few weeks. It's up to me. It's about autonomy, choice, and control. Please don't deny us.
Thank you. Christine, and then I'll just, Andrew, just to finish us, we've got 2 minutes, 1 minute. Christine, thank you. Mute.
Sorry, I muted there. Yeah, I was only going to say that one or two people have talked about other examples, other countries in Australia, and that is something which in Scotland, Liam, in the formation of his bill, is looking very closely at, is the Australian experience and talking to them there. And I, just listening to Dr. Crawley, I think those of us who feel very strongly about it, it's very often, as you alluded to as well, Karen, it's very often formed by the fact that we have experience or heard of others' experience of what death can actually be like without the option to have an assisted death. I think we demonize death in a way that we don't talk about it in a way that would be healthy.
Yeah.
And if we talked about it in a way that was healthy, we would talk about the reality and the unfortunate unpleasantness about it. And I think that is something that we have to get across in the future debate.
Yeah,
we have to be willing to talk about it in those terms.
Thank you. Agree. Andrew, just to finish us up.
Well, thanks so much. We're out of time now. We could have gone on for a long time, I think. But thanks to Karen very much for chairing today's session, and thanks to our absolutely brilliant panelists for all that they have said and the wisdom they've brought to our discussions. And I believe this is the next great British social reform, liberal reform, and I believe it's coming. And it's the desire and job of all of us on this call, all the panelists on the call, to try and make sure this happens in a decent and speedy way in accordance with public opinion. So thanks very much indeed, Karen and everyone, for today.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.